Aloha! This is the Industrial Revolution. This is 19.1 and 2 and 3 all put together. The Industrial Revolution started in Britain. So in 1750, most people were farmers. They worked on the land. They were using hand tools and they made their own cloth. They grew their own food. And with the outset of the Industrial Revolution, this way of life was going to disappear. By the 1850s, 100 years later, most of the country villages had grown into industrial towns or they had disappeared. So there was a series of related causes which helped to spark the Industrial Revolution. This made it possible in part by another revolution in agriculture. This agricultural revolution greatly improved the quality and the quantity of food. Farmers would mix different kinds of soil to try to get a new and better crop. They would also use crop rotation for higher yields. And these different farming systems actually started in the Netherlands, but they were adopted in England as well. And this actually was happening around the time when the Stuart dynasty had died away and the Queen Anne and her husband William of Orange were brought over as King and Queen of England. Meanwhile, there were a lot of rich landowners who saw that the land could be better utilized, and so they started something called the enclosure movement. This is a process of building fences around land so that it's no longer just a shared piece of land for all the animals to just roam across. It became a usually enclosed spaces that they would use to grow wheat or barley, and this was all part of the crop rotation system. So some crops drew nutrients out of the soil and put nutrients back into the soil. And barley is not as high in nutrition as wheat, and so we start to see the rise of alcohol being produced during this time as well, because they're going to use a lot of the new greater amounts of grain that are being produced to make alcoholic beverages. So actually alcoholism and hard alcohol starts to become more of a problem for society. This did create a surplus of food, so there are fewer people dying from starvation. There are more births, so the population starts to rise. The statistics show that the agricultural revolution produced a boom in the population, and that actually helped to fuel the industrial revolution as well. This is how they're connected. The agricultural process had a lot of human cost though, because all those farm laborers that had been working on the farm have to go and change and go into the manufacturing industry. So this is going to be challenging. Some of the new types of machines that were being produced were now being powered by a new source of power. And that is really key, because before the source of power was human or animal, but basically it was as fast as a human could push or pull or rotate something. That was what we were limited by. But now they're going to start utilizing forces in nature, and you can guess what they're going to use. It starts out with water, which is very, very powerful, and they would use water to turn turbines and get things moving very, very quickly. However, that limits people. Factories need to be built next to a river that's powerful enough to move the factory machinery. So a new invention was made by a Scottish engineer, James Watt, and he used coal to develop a steam engine. And the first steam engines were actually used in the mining industry. They were used to help pump water out of mines so that they could dig deeper, and it also to kind of flow the air through the mine. But it was very ineffective. After modification, that steam engine became useful in powering factories, and that's really where the steam engine became really useful. So why did it happen in England? And that's a great question. And I think the initial answer is that England had all the necessary ingredients for the Industrial Revolution. There were lots of sources of coal. Of course, we said before, there's a lot of labor that's now available. There were the rivers that they needed for the water power that they were using for factories was also important. And also, rivers were used for transportation. It's much easier to transport things via water than it is over land. England has been blessed with a lot of good harbors, very deep harbors, which were would have allowed seagoing vessels to be able to dock. So their trade was global. These were all important factors for the British leading the way in the Industrial Revolution. But there was also a cultural aspect, I think, that many historians would agree upon. And one of the big ones is the commitment of the government to a capitalist economy. Capitalism is basically where you use money to make money. That's kind of what it is. You have to have money in order to make money. Unfortunately, this is the sad part about the Industrial Revolution. A lot of the money that was accumulated, they found the money to start these factories was through the slave trade. They needed that free labor, or that nearly free labor, to accumulate enough money in order to create the factories that would then fuel the Industrial Revolution. But you have to also look at the metamorphosis that happened in their manufacturing style, because at first the English had something called the putting out system. This was a system where you have an entrepreneur who brings a whole bunch of wool to a family out in the countryside and says, hey, if you guys will convert this into cloth, then I will pay you for whatever cloth you produce, and just let me know when you're done and I'll come pick it up and I'll pay you for quality control. So if it's not good cloth, then I won't pay you very much. So what's really interesting, the very first putting out system, or the textile industry in England, was wool, because that was what they were producing locally. Wool was the only style of cloth that was available. So everybody's clothes were made out of wool. Just think about that. But as British Empire expands, it includes North America, which is a big cotton growing area. And later it's going to also expand into India. And they're going to use India as a major cotton growing area. And they would buy the cotton from those regions and transport it back to England and have it processed in England. At first in the putting out system, but that's quickly going to prove to be too slow. There's no regulation of the labor or the quality. We start to see factories being built, and usually they're built near a river so that they can have a good water source. So actually, if you look at some of the biggest towns in England today, they're usually built around a river, and they're usually built because that's where the factories started to be built in order to start producing their main industry, which was the textile industry. In order to speed up the process of making cloth, they had some really important innovations. Weaving was sped up. Then they had to make an innovation to make more thread. And once there's more thread being produced, then they have to make an innovation to make weaving more effective. That was still only as fast as how much cotton they could produce. And the problem is, cotton, when it's grown, has a whole bunch of little tiny black seeds in it. At first, they were using slave labor to get those little seeds out of the cotton. It was very time consuming. When the United States was going through its War of Independence, a young man named Eli Whitney invented a new machine which he called the cotton gin, and it was basically a big wheel that had spikes on it that would comb the cotton, and the seeds would then fall out of the gin and onto the floor. And this sped up the cotton processing time dramatically. So instead of one person having to work all day to make one amount of cotton, now you have one person working for 1 hour and producing 10 times the amount that one person could produce in one day. So it exponentially increased the amount of cotton that could be produced. Now you would think, and Eli thought, that this would be great because now we wouldn't need to have as many slaves working because we could cut down on the slave labor. So he was hoping that it would stop the slave trade, but actually it did the opposite. It encouraged slave owners to buy more slaves because now their labor was even more profitable. The cotton industry, especially in the South, kind of took off after the American Revolution because of Eli Whitney's invention. And unfortunately, Eli Whitney really didn't even profit from his own invention because people saw how effective it was and they just copied him, and they didn't pay him anything and they didn't give him any recognition. So he died poor. This is the impact that Industrial Revolution had. And as we mentioned before, people are moving from the countryside and they're moving to these new factory towns, and this process is called urbanization. Towns are growing rapidly, almost overnight. You have, within a couple of months, you'll have huge crowds of people who are looking for places to stay. Housing is premium. People are finding unorthodox or non-traditional places for them to. Factories realize that this is a problem. They will try to provide housing for the people who are coming, but it is just really rough. The first half of the Industrial Revolution was very difficult on the worker. If you were a family, you could probably rent a room in a building called a tenement, and this is a very, very cheaply made building that had no running water, no sewer system, no sanitation. You had an outhouse behind, but this would have been no lighting in the hallways, so you would have to feel your way up to your own room, and then in the room, you and your whole family are living. And at this point, families were not small generally; they were fairly large. So you slept wherever there was space, and oftentimes shifts. So you would have one person sleeping in the bed, and then 8 hours later, you have another person. You have 3 8-hour shifts of people being able able to sleep in one bed. To find water, you have to go down to the pump outside. Sometimes it was even a mile away. Sewage would seep. That was a big problem, was how to deal with this much sewage. There's so many people living in one small area. They would have people whose job it was to clean out the outhouse, to basically use buckets to scoop out all the stuff and take it away. And that was even used in processing certain things because nothing was left to waste. But it was still a very dirty environment. And as a result, lots and lots of diseases, which would spread very quickly, oftentimes through contaminated water or food. Cholera was one of the big things. Yeah, so it caused some major problems. And of course, there were many, many workers, and factory owners could demand really high workloads from their workers, and they didn't have to pay them very much because they had the power in the situation. And so if you were a worker, it was very difficult. Some of the worst industries were the mines. They would hire oftentimes women and children because women and children were automatically paid 1/3 to 2/3 less than a man in any of these industries. But mining was particularly difficult because your life expectancy was so much lower, partly because it was very dangerous. Lots of accidents would have happened in mines. They didn't have a way to test for poisonous gases that occurred frequently in mines. Also collapses of mines, and then just breathing the bad air would have been an issue, or breathing in all the dust and the fumes that happen in mines. So oftentimes the guy who owned the mine would hire kids actually, and they would not live to their adulthood. They often died. So it was pretty dangerous. And you can probably guess the workers know that they are being exploited, but there's very little that they can do as individuals. So you start to see worker movements, and they would eventually form something called labor unions. And labor unions are basically using group negotiation tactics, I guess we'll call it like that, where they would refuse to work for the wages or the conditions that the owner was trying to force them to do. By using group pressure, sometimes they were able to win some concessions. But I don't think really labor unions started to take off until even the 1900s. But people really did try. Low wages were still going to be a problem all the way up until the late 1800s. Living conditions were always a concern. The uncleanliness, the crowded conditions, the cheap yuckiness of it all. But as time goes on, things begin to change. Wages start to rise because the population doesn't grow as dramatically as it used to, so there's less workers that are competing for the jobs. Owners are having to pay more for their wages. Also, there's all the stuff that people are making in the factories. The fact that they're being made mass-produced like this makes them less expensive, which makes average people, able to buy more things. You start to see people splashing out and buying an extra set of clothes, or buying some better shoes, or buying a luxury for their family. So you start to see the quality of life rise by the end of the 1800s.